The wind in the Montana Territory had teeth in the autumn of 1876, and it bit with a special kind of spite in Red Butte. It was a town caught between two worlds, with the raw, hopeful energy of a gold mining camp on one side and the steady, weary rhythm of a cattle ranching outpost on the other. The wind did not care. It swept the same red dust over the hopeful and the weary alike, scouring the unpainted timber of the buildings and polishing the vast, bruised sky to the color of dull tin. Ada Whitfield felt that wind through the chinks in her cabin walls. It was a constant companion, whispering of loneliness and the coming freeze. She was 25 years old, a woman built for comfort and warmth in a land that offered little of either. The other women in town, wives of ranchers and merchants, had a lean, wind-whipped look to them. They saw Ada's soft curves, her deliberate, unhurried movements, and they whispered, plump, slow, a woman ill-suited for the harshness of the frontier. Ada heard the whispers, but she did not let them find a home inside her. Her hands, calloused from the garden and the lye soap, were her answer. Her kitchen, smelling of baked bread and simmering stew, was her fortress. Today, the fortress felt empty. Jebediah, her husband of 3 years, was gone. He was a man made of promises and quicksilver smiles, a prospector who saw fortune over every next rise. The latest fever was for a place called Elk's Spine, a jagged scar in the mountains rumored to hold a thick vein of gold. He had packed his mule that morning, his eyes shining with a familiar, restless light. "It's the one, Ada," he had said, his hands gripping her shoulders. "I can feel it in my bones. A real strike this time. No more scratching in the dirt for pennies. I'll come back for you, and we'll have a house with glass windows. 2 stories. He kissed her, a quick, dry press of his lips, and was gone. He left behind the scent of sweat and leather, a pile of debt notices for a new water pump he had insisted they needed, and the silence. Ada stood at the door and watched him shrink into the vast, red landscape until he was just another speck of dust. She looked at her small garden, where the corn stalks stood like brittle skeletons, and at the weathered gray planks of her cabin. This was real. The 2-story house with glass windows was a ghost, a pretty story told to make the leaving easier. She spent the day in a flurry of familiar work, the only antidote she knew for a heavy heart. She swept the floor, kneaded a batch of sourdough, and sorted her dwindling supply of beans as dusk bled across the sky, painting it in shades of purple and bruised orange. The cabin grew cold. She built up the fire in the hearth, the crackle and pop of the pine logs a welcome noise in the profound quiet. She sat in her rocker, a mending basket in her lap, and watched the flames dance. She did not cry. Tears were a luxury, like glass windows. A sharp knock on the door startled her from her thoughts. It was too firm, too official, to be a neighbor. Jeb's friends were loud, their knocks full of boisterous energy. This was different. She set her basket aside, her heart giving a nervous flutter, and opened the door. The man standing on her porch seemed to be carved from the Montana twilight itself. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He took it off as she opened the door, revealing a plain, serious face and hair the color of wet sand. But it was his eyes that held her. They were gray, the same turbulent, stormy gray as the sky just before a blizzard, and they looked at her with a steady, unreadable calm. She recognized him instantly. Sheriff Elias Boone, a man who spoke little and saw much. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said. His voice was low and even, a gravelly sound that seemed to fit the stony landscape. "Sheriff," she replied, her hand clutching the edge of the door. "Is everything all right?" He held up a folded piece of paper. "I am sorry to disturb you this late. This is an official notice from the bank, from Mr. Silas Creed." She took the paper, her fingers feeling clumsy and thick. She unfolded it by the flickering firelight, her eyes scanning the neat, looping script. The words were full of legal terms she did not understand. but the meaning was as clear and cold as a winter creek. Foreclosure. Default on a loan. The property, this small cabin and the dusty patch of land it sat on, was listed as collateral. "I do not understand," she said, her voice a small thing against the rising wind. "We have no loan with the bank." Sheriff Boone's expression did not change, but a flicker of something, perhaps pity, moved in his gray eyes. "It appears your husband took one out 2 months ago, ma'am. He signed the deed over as security." The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. Jeb had not just left her. He had sold the ground from beneath her feet. He had wagered their home on a ghost of a promise, on the feverish dream of gold. She sank into the nearest chair, the paper trembling in her hand. The 2-story house with glass windows was not just a ghost. It was a cruel joke. "Mr. Creed wants the property vacated," the sheriff said, his tone still quiet, still direct. He was not a man for soft words or gentle evasions. He delivered the truth like a piece of mail, leaving the recipient to deal with its contents. When she whispered, staring into the fire, "The notice says immediately," "But that is not how I do things." He shifted his weight, the leather of his gun belt creaking softly. "The law gives you 30 days, Mrs. Whitfield. I will see that you get them. Not a day less." She looked up at him then, truly looked. He was not enjoying this. There was no relish in his duty, only a weary resignation. He was the law in Red Butte, and the law, like the wind, was often harsh and unforgiving. Yet, he was giving her a small measure of shelter from it. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, her voice finding a sliver of its strength. "There is no need for thanks. It is what is right." He placed his hat back on his head. "Good evening, ma'am." He turned and walked away, his tall frame disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Ada alone with the crackling fire and the devastating truth. The news of Jeb's departure and Ada's predicament spread through Red Butte faster than a prairie fire. By the next morning, it was the main topic of conversation at the general store and the saloon. The whispers that had once called her slow now called her a fool. Left her high and dry, chuckled a ranch hand, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. That's what happens when you trust a man with gold fever. And him mortgaging the house right under her nose. Clucked one of the merchant's wives, her voice dripping with sanctimonious pity. Poor thing, she's too simple to have seen it coming. Ada heard it all. She saw the sideways glances, the poorly concealed smirks. Her first instinct was to hide, to bar the door of her cabin and wait for the 30 days to run out. But then a different feeling took root, a stubborn shoot of pride pushing up through the fear and humiliation. She would not be an object of pity. She would not be defined by Jeb's fecklessness or the town's scorn. 2 days after the sheriff's visit, she hitched their old mule to the rickety wagon, loaded up her largest cast-iron pot, a sack of beans, smoked pork, a bag of cornmeal, and a bundle of firewood, and drove it to the edge of the town square where the market was held. She built a small, clean fire and set the pot to simmer. The rich, savory scent of her chili-spiced bean stew, thick with meat and scented with smoke, began to drift through the crisp air. It was a smell of warmth, of substance, of home. People stopped. They were drawn by the aroma, their curiosity overcoming their judgment. A few miners, their faces grim with dust, bought a bowl, then a few ranch hands. They ate standing up, cupping the warm bowls in their hands, their silence a testament to the food's quality. Ada worked quietly, her movements efficient and sure. She ladled the stew, cut thick slices of cornbread from a skillet, and took their coins with a quiet nod. She was not asking for charity. She was working. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Sheriff Boone appeared. He moved through the small crowd with that same unnerving quiet, his presence seeming to take up more space than his body. The gossips fell silent as he approached her makeshift stall. He looked at the bubbling pot, then at her. Her face was smudged with soot and flushed from the fire, but her chin was high. "Smells good, Mrs. Whitfield," he said. "It will keep out the cold." "Sheriff," she replied, her voice steady. He nodded. "I will take a bowl, and a piece of that cornbread, if you please." She served him a generous portion. Handing him the heavy earthenware bowl, he passed her 2 coins, more than enough to cover the cost. She started to give him the change, but he put up a hand to stop her. "The extra is for the cornbread," he said, his gray eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. "It looks like it would warm a man through on a night with a cold wind." Without another word, he turned and walked to a nearby bench, where he sat and ate, his gaze fixed on the distant, jagged line of the mountains. He did not speak to her again, but he did not need to. It was a small gesture, a simple purchase, but in the cold, judgmental landscape of Red Butte, it felt like a crackling fire. It was a quiet acknowledgement, not of her plight, but of her labor. And for Ada, that was more valuable than 1,000 words of pity. She watched him for a moment before turning back to her pot, a new, fragile resolve settling in her heart. The wind still had teeth, but for the first time in days, she felt she might just be strong enough to face it. The stew pot became Ada Whitfield's anchor and her shield. For 3 weeks, she maintained her small post at the edge of the square, her fire a small beacon against the encroaching chill. She learned the rhythms of the town's hunger. The miners came early, before descending into the dark maw of the earth, their bowls held in hands permanently stained with rock and grit. The ranchers and their hands drifted in later, their talk of cattle prices and weather patterns a low hum in the air. She served them all with the same quiet efficiency, her face calm, her movements measured. The town watched her. The whispers had not stopped, but they had changed their tune. Scorn was now mixed with a grudging respect. A woman working to pay her own husband's debts was a sight to behold, even if she was, as they still muttered, a bit plump for a frontier wife. Ada felt their eyes on her, a constant, prickling scrutiny. She ignored them and focused on the simmering pot, on the precise measure of salt and spice, on the comforting weight of the ladle in her hand. She was earning enough to buy flour and beans, to keep the fire in her hearth alive. The 30 days given by the sheriff loomed, but they no longer felt like a death sentence. They felt like a challenge. One evening, the wind changed. The usual biting cold was replaced by a dry, suffocating force that picked up the red dust and flung it against her cabin in gritty sheets. The sky turned a sickly yellow-brown, and the sun disappeared behind a thick, swirling haze, a sandstorm. It was a vicious, blinding force that erased the world, sealing people inside their homes like tombs. Ada secured the shutters, stuffed rags into the cracks around the door, and lit a lantern, its small flame a defiant pinprick against the roaring dark. The wind howled like a starving wolf, and the fine dust, relentless, found its way inside, coating every surface with a fine red film. Hours passed in the roaring chaos. Ada sat by the fire, listening, her senses on edge. Sometime after midnight, through a lull in the wind's scream, she heard it, a sound that did not belong, a splintering crash, the shriek of tortured wood, followed by a man's sharp, terrified cry that was abruptly cut off. It came from the direction of the western slope, the steep, treacherous track that led down from the mining operations. Then another sound rose, thin and piercing, almost lost in the gale. It was the sound of a child weeping. Ada did not hesitate. The sound cut through her own fear, a call to action that resonated deep in her soul. She grabbed a thick wool shawl, her sharpest kitchen knife, and a small jug of vinegar from the pantry. She soaked a rag in the pungent liquid, tied it around her nose and mouth, and, taking a deep breath, unbarred the door. The force of the wind nearly threw her from her feet. The air was a thick, choking torrent of sand that stung her eyes and scoured her skin. She pulled the shawl tight over her head, bent low against the gale, and fought her way forward, the lantern casting a feeble, dancing light that was swallowed by the storm just a few feet in front of her. She followed the memory of the sound, her feet sinking into the shifting dust, her world reduced to a maelstrom of noise and stinging grit. She found the wreck at the bottom of the slope, a heavy freight wagon, the kind used to haul blasting powder and supplies for the mine, lay on its side. One of its massive wheels shattered. Crates were strewn about, their contents spilled across the trail, under the wreckage of the driver's seat. A pair of legs in canvas trousers stuck out at an unnatural angle, but Ada's eyes were drawn to a small shape huddled beside the splintered axle. A little girl, no older than 6, was curled into a tight ball, her small body shaking with sobs. Her hair was long and black, and her skin was the color of warm copper. She was Cheyenne, or part Cheyenne, a small, lost soul in the heart of the storm. Ada knelt, her own body a shield against the wind. "It is all right," she said, her voice muffled by the cloth but pitched low and calm. "I am here to help." The child looked up, her dark eyes wide with terror. Ada gently touched her shoulder. "Are you hurt?" The girl shook her head, tears tracing clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. She pointed a trembling finger toward the trapped driver. "Papa," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound. Ada moved to the man. He was pinned by the heavy wooden seat and a splintered support beam. His breathing was shallow, and a dark stain was spreading across his pant leg. She knew she could not move the wagon herself. She had to get him out from under the crushing weight. She worked quickly, her mind clear and focused. Using her knife, she began to cut away at the man's trousers, exposing a deep, ragged gash in his thigh where a piece of broken wood had pierced him. The wound was bleeding freely, the blood mixing with the red dust to form a dark paste. Remembering a lesson from an old trapper's wife, Ada searched the ground around the wreck. The storm had ripped plants from the earth, and by the faint light of her lantern, she found what she was looking for, a clump of wild sage, its gray-green leaves tough and fragrant. She crushed a handful of leaves, the familiar, cleansing scent rising to cut through the dust, and pressed them firmly into the wound. It was a crude bandage, but it would have to do. Her attention then turned to the beam pinning his chest. It was wedged tight. She looked around, her eyes scanning the debris. A long, sturdy iron pry bar, used for opening crates, lay half-buried in the sand. It was heavy, but her arms, strengthened by years of kneading dough and lifting cast iron, were strong. She worked the end of the bar under the beam, found her leverage, and threw all of her weight into it. The beam groaned, shifted, and then, with a final, desperate heave, she moved it just enough. The man gasped, and she was able to pull him, inch by agonizing inch, from the trap. Just as she dragged him clear, she saw other lights bobbing through the storm. Sheriff Boone and 3 other men, their faces wrapped in bandanas, arrived. Drawn by the same sounds that had called to her, they stopped short, their lanterns illuminating the scene: the overturned wagon, the injured man lying on the ground, and Ada, her hair wild and her face caked with mud, kneeling beside the small, weeping child. Elias Boone's gray eyes took in everything at once. He saw the vinegar-soaked rag still tied around her neck, the sage packed into the miner's wound, the heavy pry bar lying nearby. He saw how she had her arm around the little girl, murmuring soft words of comfort. He saw a woman who had run toward disaster, not away from it. He had arrived too late to be the rescuer, but he was in time to witness the rescue. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and coated in a fresh layer of red. The sky was a pale, fragile blue. Ada was sweeping the last of the dust from her cabin when she saw it. Sitting on her windowsill, nestled against the weathered wood, was a small, fragrant bundle of rosemary, tied with a piece of twine. Tucked into the sprigs was a small piece of folded paper. Her heart gave a curious leap. She opened it. The handwriting was stark and masculine. It said only. for the next batch of beans. Later that day, the whispers started again, but now they were laced with a new, sharper venom. Silas Creed, the banker, a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes, was holding court in the general store. "A woman of the kitchen has no business meddling in the affairs of the mine," he said, his voice smooth and condescending. He looked at Deputy Lane, a burly man with a perpetually sour expression who shadowed the sheriff like a bad mood. Lane snorted. "Running out into a storm like a mad woman? It is unseemly. And that business with the herbs, Indian nonsense." "She is making a spectacle of herself," Creed continued, polishing his spectacles. "And this business of selling food in the square, it seems she has found a new way to get men's attention. Now that her husband is gone, the insinuation was as ugly as it was plain. The rumor spread, twisting and turning as it passed from one person to the next. Ada Whitfield was using her cooking to lure men to find a replacement for the husband who had abandoned her. Ada felt the sting of the gossip, but she had little time to dwell on it. A message had arrived from Mr. Claymore, the proprietor of the town's only inn and eatery. He was an old, gruff man with a surprising sense of fairness. He had heard the full story of the rescue from the injured miner, whose name was Henry, and from Sheriff Boone himself. He requested Ada's presence. She found him in the inn's large, bustling kitchen. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, getting straight to the point. "Henry says you saved his life, and the sheriff says you kept your head better than most men would have. I have a problem. With the new vein at the mine, we have more men than beds. A dozen of them are bunking in my stable, and my cook is threatening to quit. The sheriff's patrol also takes their meals here. It is too much for one man." He paused, studying her. "I have tasted your stew. It is honest food. I need someone to take over the cooking for the miners and the patrol, a steady contract. It will pay enough to keep a roof over your head. And then some. Are you interested?" It was a lifeline. More than a lifeline. It was a foundation, a way to build something of her own, on her own terms. It meant long hours, hard work, and facing the town's judgment every single day, but it also meant survival. It meant she could save her home. "Yes, Mr. Claymore," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I am very interested." She walked home as the sun set, the scent of rosemary from her windowsill mingling with the clean, cold air. The whispers and the rumors were still out there, hiding in the shadows. But now, she had a new purpose, a new fire to tend. The town of Red Butte was about to learn that Ada Whitfield's quiet determination, like her bean stew, was a force to be reckoned with. The kitchen at the Claymore house became Ada's world. It was a large, hot, perpetually noisy space that smelled of baking bread, roasting meat, and strong coffee. Her days began before the sun rose and ended long after it had set, a rhythm dictated by the rumbling stomachs of miners and lawmen. She moved through the chaos with a newfound purpose, her hands, her pots, and her ingredients her unwavering allies. The town's gossip had not vanished, but it had been forced to the periphery, drowned out by the clatter of plates and the satisfied sighs of well-fed men. She was no longer just Jebediah Whitfield's abandoned wife. She was Ada, the cook who could turn beans and bacon into a feast. But as the weeks bled into a month, a new, more relentless adversary arrived. The autumn sun, which should have been mellowing, beat down with a fierce, summer-like intensity. The rains, meager as they had been, stopped altogether. The Dry Needle River, the town's lifeblood, began to shrink, its banks widening into cracked, sun-baked mud. It dwindled from a river to a creek, and then to a series of stagnant, algae-choked pools. Water became the new gold. Silas Creed saw his opportunity. The only reliable source of fresh water left was a deep, cold spring on the edge of town known as Alligator Well. It bubbled up from the earth on a small plot of land that, by a cruel twist of fate, bordered Ada's property. Jebediah had always said the well was on their land. but the survey markers were old and faded, the lines blurred by time and neglect. Creed, with his sharp legal mind and his collection of deeds, produced a document that claimed the well and the land around it belonged to the bank. Suddenly, he was not just Ada's creditor. He was the town's water baron. He posted a sign at the well, declaring a price of 5 cents a bucket, a staggering sum for most families. The tension in Red Butte pulled taut. Men who had been neighbors for years eyed each other with suspicion at the town's communal water barrel, which was now guarded and rationed. Ada, with her constant need for water for her big stew pots and for boiling potatoes, felt the squeeze most acutely. She paid Creed's exorbitant price, her hard-earned coins clinking into his collection box with a sound that felt like defeat. Nature, it seemed, was in league with the banker. The dry air and the desperation of the animals in the surrounding hills brought a new threat. One night, a pack of prairie wolves, their ribs showing and their eyes glowing with a feral hunger, grew bold. They slinked from the shadows of the bluffs and began to circle the town's stables, their low, hunting growls carrying on the still night air. The alarm was raised by a single, terrified whinny, followed by the sound of splintering wood as a panicked horse kicked at its stall. Men tumbled out of the saloon and their homes, carrying rifles and lanterns. Sheriff Boone was there first, his voice a calm, authoritative force in the chaos. "Get torches. Keep them back from the doors," he commanded. Ada had been cleaning up her kitchen at the inn when she heard the commotion. She ran outside and saw the shadowy forms darting at the edge of the lantern light. She saw the fear on the men's faces, the wildness in the eyes of the cornered horses. Elias Boone was trying to organize a defense, but the wolves were clever, flanking them, testing their nerve. An idea sparked in Ada's mind, born of practicality and kitchen sense. She ran to the nearest haystack, grabbed 2 pitchforks, and began pulling down huge clumps of straw. "Help me," she called to a young ranch hand who was standing frozen with a rifle he looked too scared to use. "We need buckets of water." Quickly. He stared at her, confused, but the urgency in her voice spurred him to action. Elias saw what she was doing and immediately understood. "Do as she says," he yelled. "Get water, soak the straw." They worked together in the flickering, chaotic light. Ada and 2 other men drenched the piles of hay she had made, while Elias and the rest of the men formed a protective line, firing their guns into the air to keep the circling pack at bay. "Light them now," Ada shouted. They touched the torches to the wet straw. It did not burst into flame but began to smolder, releasing a thick, acrid cloud of white smoke. The wind, which had been so cruel during the sandstorm, was now their ally. It caught the smoke and carried it in a dense, choking blanket toward the wolves. The animals, their sensitive noses overwhelmed, yelped in confusion and distress. They broke their circling pattern, hesitated, and then, as one, melted back into the darkness from which they came. In the aftermath, the men stood coughing and slapping each other on the back, their relief palpable. Elias walked over to Ada, who was leaning against a fence post, catching her breath. Her face was streaked with soot, and she smelled of smoke and wet hay. That was quick thinking. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, his gray eyes holding a new depth of respect. "Fire scares them," she said simply, "but smoke makes them blind." He just nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his mouth. The next week, another sign of the changing world arrived in Red Butte. A crew of men, their hands and faces weathered by sun and wind, finished stringing a thin strand of iron wire to a pole in the center of town. The telegraph had come. It felt like a miracle, a direct line to a world far beyond their dusty horizons. The first message it brought, however, was not one of progress, but one of disruption. News clicked and chattered across the wire of a massive gold strike in the Black Hills, a find that made the prospects at Elk's Spine look like a child's sandbox. The effect was immediate. The gold fever that had taken Jebediah now infected half the men in the mine. Within 2 days, a dozen of them had packed their belongings and left, chasing the new, more glittering promise. The mine's production slowed, the town's already fragile economy faltered, and a fresh wave of anxiety settled over Red Butte. Through it all, Ada found solace in a small, leather-bound notebook. It had been a gift from a woman who had been the head cook at a mission where Ada had briefly stayed as a girl. The woman had been stern and silent, but she had recognized a kindred spirit in the young girl who watched her every move in the kitchen. The notebook was filled with her own spidery script, recipes for everything from sourdough starter to juniper berry salve. Now, Ada added her own. In the quiet hours of the night, by the light of a single candle, she would write. She documented her recipe for chili-spiced beans, for a skillet cornbread that was crisp on the outside and tender within, for a venison stew that could make a man forget his troubles. It was more than a collection of recipes. It was a testament to her own worth. When the whispers of the town made her feel small, when the memory of Jeb's abandonment left a hollow ache in her chest, she would open the book. Here, in these pages, she was not slow or plump or foolish. She was a creator, a nurturer, a woman of skill. One afternoon, she was in the Claymore kitchen, up to her elbows in a huge bowl of flour, preparing dough for the evening's bread. A small, stray calico cat, which had recently adopted the inn as its home, was sleeping on a nearby shelf. A loud clatter from the street outside startled the animal. It leaped in fright, lost its footing, and landed with a soft thump right in the middle of the mountain of flour. A cloud of white erupted, covering the cat, the table, and Ada in a fine, powdery dust. The cat, looking utterly bewildered and now completely white except for its two green eyes, sneezed, shot out of the bowl, and scurried out the back door, leaving a trail of tiny, white paw prints. Ada stood there, speechless, a dusting of white on her hair and eyelashes, looking at the feline-shaped crater in her flour. A low chuckle came from the doorway. She turned to see Sheriff Boone leaning against the frame, a wide, genuine smile on his face. It was the first time she had ever seen him truly smile, and it transformed his stern features, making him look younger and unexpectedly handsome. He pushed himself off the doorframe and walked in, the smile turning into a quiet laugh. "Well," he said, his eyes crisscrossing the white-coated kitchen, "this flour storm is a good deal more pleasant than the one we had a few weeks back." Ada looked at the mess, at her own flour-dusted state, and felt a bubble of laughter rise in her own chest. She laughed, a real, full-bodied laugh that had been absent for too long. For a moment, they just stood there, sharing the simple, ridiculous humor of the scene. The tension of the drought, the wolves, and the worried town seemed to fade away, replaced by the easy comfort of a shared laugh. The moment of peace was short-lived. The next morning, as Ada went to the alligator well to draw her first buckets of the day, she found Silas Creed waiting for her. Deputy Lane stood beside him, his arms crossed over his thick chest, a smug look on his face. "Mrs. Whitfield," Creed said, his voice slick as oil, "as you know, this well is on bank property. From now on, to ensure proper accounting, payment will be collected on site, at the time of service." "I have been paying," Ada said, her hand tightening on the handle of her wooden bucket. "I leave the money in the box every day." But this is a more efficient system," Creed said, smiling his cold smile. Deputy Lane took a step forward. "You heard him. He barked, his voice unnecessarily loud. You want water. You pay now. 5 cents a bucket. Cash." Ada stood her ground, her eyes flashing with a spark of defiance. This was not about efficiency. This was about power. It was about humiliating her, about reminding her, and anyone else who might be watching, that Silas Creed was in control. "This is my home," she said, her voice low but firm. "This well has served my family and our neighbors for years. You have no right." "I have this right," Creed said, tapping a folded document he produced from his coat pocket. "A legally filed deed. Now, are you going to pay, or are you going to be thirsty today?" Lane took another menacing step toward her. "Pay the man, Mrs. Whitfield, or I will escort you off this property myself." "That will not be necessary. Deputy—" The voice came from behind them, quiet but laced with steel. Sheriff Elias Boone had walked up, his movements so silent they had not heard him approach. He stopped beside Ada, his presence a solid, unmovable wall. He did not look at Creed. His stormy gray eyes were fixed on his deputy. "The law allows Mr. Creed to charge for his water," Elias said, his voice even. "It does not allow you to threaten a citizen. Deputy Lane, your job is to keep the peace, not to act as a private debt collector." Lane's face reddened with anger and embarrassment. "I was just enforcing the transaction," he stammered. "I am capable of witnessing a transaction myself," Elias said, his gaze unwavering. "You have other duties. See to them." The deputy glared at Elias, a look of pure animosity in his eyes. But he did not dare disobey a direct order in public. He turned on his heel and stomped away. Elias then turned to Silas Creed. He took 5 coins from his pocket and held them out to the banker. "For Mrs. Whitfield's first bucket," he said. He then took the bucket from Ada's unresisting hand, lowered it into the well, and drew up the clear, cold water. He passed the heavy, dripping bucket back to her. Their hands brushed for a moment, and a jolt of warmth passed between them, a current stronger than any telegraph wire. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes communicating a message of steadfast support. Creed took the money, his lips pressed into a thin, angry line. He had won the small battle over the 5 cents, but he had lost something much larger. He had tried to isolate Ada, to make an example of her. Instead, he had revealed the growing fissure between himself and the sheriff, and had pushed Ada and Elias closer together. The fire that had been smoldering was now burning openly, and the whole town of Red Butte was watching to see what would catch light next. The railroad was a beast of iron and steam, and its weekly arrival was the event that tied Red Butte to the outside world. The shriek of its whistle echoed off the bluffs, a promise of mail, supplies, and news. For Ada, it meant the arrival of fresh sacks of flour, barrels of salt pork, and sometimes a crate of precious onions or potatoes. The arrival of the train carrying the mine payroll, however, was a special occasion. It was a day of palpable relief, when the town's collective breath, held tight with credit and debt, was finally released. On this particular afternoon, the air was crisp and clear, the sky a vast, empty blue. Ada stood outside the Claymore kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, watching the plume of black smoke grow on the horizon. The train was on time. A small crowd had gathered at the depot, a mix of miners waiting for their pay, merchants eager to settle accounts, and children simply enthralled by the spectacle of the locomotive. She saw Sheriff Boone standing near the station master's office, his posture relaxed, but his gaze watchful. He caught her eye from across the dusty expanse and gave a slow, deliberate nod. A warmth spread through her chest, a quiet acknowledgement that had become a familiar, comforting presence in her life. The train chugged into the station with a great sigh of steam and a screech of brakes. The heavy strongbox containing the payroll was unloaded by 2 burly guards and placed on a wagon for the short trip to the bank. Everything was routine, orderly. The town exhaled. Ada turned to go back inside, the pleasant thought of the fresh coffee beans she was expecting foremost in her mind. The chaos erupted less than an hour later. It started with a frantic ringing of the church bell, not the steady peal for Sunday service, but a wild, panicked clangor. Then came the shouts. A lone rider galloped into town from the east, his horse lathered in sweat, his face pale with shock. The payroll wagon never made it to the bank. It had been ambushed just a mile out of town, on a lonely stretch of trail flanked by rocky outcrops. A gang of masked riders, at least a half-dozen of them, had swarmed the wagon. There had been a short, brutal exchange of gunfire. Both guards were down. One gone for good, the other badly wounded. The strongbox was gone. The riders had vanished back into the unforgiving landscape as if they were ghosts. They were calling themselves the Dust Jackals. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through the town. The stolen payroll was not just the bank's money. It was every miner's sweat and toil, every merchant's livelihood, every family's food for the coming month. A grim, angry crowd converged on the sheriff's office. Silas Creed was at the forefront, his face a mask of public outrage that did little to conceal the glint of opportunity in his eyes. "What are you going to do, Sheriff?" he demanded, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "This is an outrage. Our town is under siege by criminals." Elias Boone stood on the steps of his office, facing them all down. His face was a granite slab, his gray eyes sweeping over the anxious faces. "I have sent for a doctor from Fort Shaw for the wounded guard. My men are already on the trail, looking for tracks. We will find them." His calm voice did little to soothe the frayed nerves. The crowd grew larger, their fear curdling into anger. They needed someone to blame, a focus for their frustration. And Silas Creed, ever the opportunist, was ready to give them one. Deputy Lane pushed his way through the crowd, holding something aloft. It was a grimy, torn piece of cloth. It was blue-checked gingham, the same pattern as the aprons Ada wore in the kitchen. "Found this snagged on a greasewood bush near where the ambush happened." "Sheriff," Lane announced, his voice booming with self-importance. "Looks mighty familiar. Does it not?" A low, dangerous murmur rippled through the crowd. All eyes turned toward the Claymore house, where Ada had just stepped outside, drawn by the noise. She saw the scrap of fabric in Lane's hand, and a cold dread washed over her. She recognized it instantly. It was from the apron she had been wearing the night of the freight wagon crash, the one she had torn on a piece of jagged metal while pulling the driver to safety. She had meant to mend it, but in the blur of her new duties, she had forgotten. It must have fallen from her wagon on her way home that night and lain there for weeks. "It is the cooks!" someone shouted. The Whitfield woman yelled another. Silas Creed stepped forward, seizing the moment. "It is an interesting coincidence. Is it not a woman whose husband ran off, leaving her with a mountain of debt, a woman who suddenly finds herself in a position of trust, feeding the very men whose payroll has just been stolen?" The insinuation was monstrous, a leap of logic fueled by malice. But the crowd was not in a mood for logic. They were a tinderbox of fear and suspicion, and Creed had just struck the match. "She probably signaled them," a voice cried out. "Her husband is probably one of them." The murmur became a roar. The crowd began to move, a single, menacing entity, flowing from the sheriff's office toward the inn, toward her. Ada stood frozen on the porch, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw their faces, twisted with an ugly, righteous fury. These were people she served every day, people whose hunger she satisfied. Now, they looked at her as if she were a venomous snake. Elias Boone moved faster than she had ever seen him move. He was off the steps in 2 long strides, planting himself directly in the path of the mob, his hand held up. "That is enough," his voice cracked like a whip, cutting through the noise. "You will all stand down. This is a piece of cloth. It proves nothing." "It proves she was out there," Lane countered, stepping up to challenge his boss, where she had no business being. "Get out of the way," Sheriff a man yelled from the back. "We will get the truth out of her." The crowd surged forward. Elias did not draw his weapon. Instead, he drew himself up to his full height, an immovable object against the tide of their anger. A big, brawny miner tried to push past him. Elias caught him by the shoulder, spun him around, and shoved him back so hard he stumbled and fell. The brief, sharp scuffle was all the mob needed. They pressed in, a wall of angry bodies. Elias was pushed back, step by step, toward the porch where Ada stood. He was trying to keep them at bay, to reason with them, but it was like trying to reason with a flood. Ada saw a fist fly, catching Elias on the side of the head. He staggered, and in that moment, the crowd broke through. They swarmed onto the porch. Hands reached for her. Ada cried out, stumbling backward, but before they could lay a finger on her, Elias was there. He shouldered two men aside, grabbed Ada by the arm, and pulled her behind him, shielding her with his body. I said, "That is enough," he roared. And this time, the sheer force of his command gave them a moment's pause. In that moment, he made a decision. He kept one arm protectively in front of Ada and spoke in a low, urgent voice only she could hear. "I am taking you to the jail. It is the only place you will be safe. Do not fight me. Do you understand?" She looked at his face, saw the grim determination in his eyes, and nodded, her throat too tight for words. To the crowd, it looked like an arrest. He turned, his hand firmly on her arm, and marched her off the porch and through the stunned mob. "She is in my custody now," he announced, his voice ringing with authority. "There will be no mob justice in this town. Go home, all of you." He did not look back. He propelled her across the square and into the sheriff's office. The small building was an oasis of quiet after the roar of the crowd. He led her past his desk to a narrow door at the back and opened it. Inside was a small, clean cell with a simple cot. He gently urged her inside and then closed and locked the barred door. He stood on the other side of the bars, his chest heaving slightly from the exertion. There was a fresh, raw scrape high on his cheekbone where a man's ring had caught him. "You will stay here for the night," he said, his voice softer now. "I will post a guard. No one will get to you." "Thank you," she whispered, her whole body trembling. He just looked at her, his gray eyes dark with a mixture of anger and concern. "Get some rest, Ada." He left, and she sank onto the hard cot, the sound of the mob's fading shouts still ringing in her ears. An hour later, he returned. He carried a tin plate with a slice of bread and cheese, a mug of black coffee, and a small bowl of water with a clean cloth. He unlocked the cell door but did not open it. He passed the plate and mug through the bars. "It is not your cooking," he said, a faint hint of a smile in his voice. She took them, her hands still shaking. She watched as he dipped the cloth in the bowl of water and began to clean the cut on his cheek. He winced as he dabbed at it. "You are hurt," she said. "It is nothing." "Let me," she said, surprising herself with her own boldness. She set the plate and mug on the cot and went to the bars. "Please." He hesitated for a moment, then came closer, turning his face toward her. She reached through the bars, her touch incredibly gentle as she took the cloth from him. Her fingers brushed against his skin as she carefully cleaned the scrape, her movements deft and sure. He stood perfectly still, his eyes closed, breathing in the faint scent of flower and herbs that always seemed to cling to her. They were close, separated only by the cold iron bars. The air in the small room was thick with unspoken things. "It is a heavy burden," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "Your job." He opened his eyes. They were inches from hers. "Some days are heavier than others," he said, his voice a low rumble. He looked at her, his gaze intense. "It is a lonely business, keeping the peace." "I know something of loneliness," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. She finished cleaning the small wound and her hand fell away. The warmth of his skin lingered on her fingertips. They stood there for a long moment in a comfortable, profound silence, the coffee growing cold on the cot. Finally, he stepped back, breaking the spell. "I should go," he said. He placed the torn piece of her apron on the small shelf outside her cell. "This is the evidence they found." He left her then, locking the office door behind him. Ada was alone again, in the strange, quiet safety of the jail cell. She picked up the mug of coffee and took a sip, its bitterness a welcome shock to her senses. Her eyes fell on the scrap of blue gingham lying on the shelf. She reached through the bars and picked it up, her fingers tracing the rough, torn edge. She brought it closer to the lantern light, examining it more closely. It was hers, no doubt about it, but as she turned it over in her hands, her blood ran cold. Along one of the machine-stitched seams, there was another, cruder line of stitching. It was a small, cross-hatched pattern, sewn with thick, dark thread. She knew that stitch. She had seen it 1,000 times. It was Jebediah's mark. He was not a man who was good with a needle, but he had a possessive streak. He marked everything he considered his own, his tools, his saddlebags, his bedroll, with that same clumsy, distinctive cross-stitch. She stared at the stitches, her mind reeling. The fabric was from her apron, torn from her the night she rescued the miner. Jeb could not have been there that night, so how did his mark get on a piece of evidence found at the site of a train robbery that happened today? The only possible answer hit her with the force of a physical blow. The scrap of apron had been found at the robbery because someone had put it there. And that someone must have gotten it from Jeb. Jebediah was here. He was not in the Black Hills, chasing a new dream of gold. He was close, so close that he could plant false evidence. And he was not alone. He was with them, the dust jackals. Her husband was a train robber, and he had just tried to send her to the gallows. The long, terrifying night in the jail cell passed in a haze of fear and dawning, horrifying clarity. Ada did not sleep. She sat on the cot, the scrap of gingham clutched in her hand. The image of Jebediah's clumsy cross-stitch burned into her mind. He was here. He was a criminal. He had tried to sacrifice her to save his own skin. The man she had married, the man of quicksilver smiles and grand promises, was a stranger, a monster hiding behind a familiar face. Sheriff Boone returned with the dawn. He looked tired, his face drawn and taut, but his eyes were clear. He unlocked her cell door and opened it. "You are free to go, Ada," he said quietly. She stood, her legs stiff and unsteady. "They will not believe me," she said, her voice hoarse. "The crowd—" "The crowd will be quiet for now," he interrupted. "My tracker found the outlaws' trail heading north into the breaks. He also found something else. One of their horses is shod with a distinctive shoe, a U-shaped notch cut from the right fore. It is the mark of a horse that belonged to a known outlaw, a man named Silas Blackwood who rides with the dust jackals. The tracks prove the gang came from the north and fled to the north. They were never near your cabin. It was a reprieve, a temporary stay of execution. It did not erase the fact that her apron scrap had been found there, but it was enough to introduce doubt, to cool the mob's immediate fury. He walked with her back to the Claymore house. The town was quiet, but it was a watchful, suspicious quiet. People stopped and stared as they passed. Doors were quietly closed. She felt their judgment like a physical weight. The whispers had returned, no longer accusing her of robbery, but of something more nebulous, more poisonous. She was trouble. She was the woman who drew disaster in her wake. Silas Creed was not content to let the matter rest. Having lost the opportunity to see Ada jailed for the robbery, he simply changed his line of attack. He stood on the steps of his bank that afternoon, addressing a small but growing group of disgruntled miners and merchants. "The sheriff may be satisfied with a horseshoe print," Creed announced, his voice ringing with false concern. "But I ask you, what about the debts of this town? What about the character of those we allow to live among us, the Whitfield house? That very property where the notorious alligator well sits is saddled with a debt that this woman makes no effort to pay. She profits from our hunger while her own obligations go unanswered. Is that the kind of justice we want in Red Butte?" He was a master of his craft, turning their fear of the outlaws into resentment for a lone woman. He was poisoning the well of public opinion, making her presence in the town an offense, a constant reminder of unpaid debts and broken promises. The effects were immediate. The number of men coming to the Claymore kitchen for their meals dwindled. Those who did come ate in silence, their eyes averted, leaving their money on the table without a word. Mr. Claymore was apologetic, but he could not force men to eat where they felt uncomfortable. Her income, the very means by which she hoped to save her home, was being strangled. 2 days later, Elias Boone came to the kitchen in the late afternoon. The room was unnaturally quiet, only a single pot of soup simmering on the stove. Ada was sitting at the table, staring at the figures in her little leather-bound notebook. The numbers did not lie. She was failing. "It is not safe for you here," Elias said, his voice low. He did not waste time with pleasantries. Creed is stirring them up. It is only a matter of time before someone gets bolder. "Where can I go?" she asked, a wave of despair washing over her. "This is my work. It is all I have." "My office," he said. "There is a small room at the back. Next to the cells, it has a stove and a cot. It was meant for the deputy. But Lane prefers the boarding house. You could cook from there. Your contract is with the town to feed my men and the miners staying at the inn. The location does not matter. It is secure. I can keep an eye on things." It was a radical proposal. To move into the jail, to live and work under the sheriff's direct protection, was to tie her fate to his in a way that could not be undone. It would silence some whispers and give birth to a host of others, more scandalous and personal. But looking at the quiet resolve in his face, she knew it was her only real choice. It was a choice between a slow, public starvation of her livelihood and a retreat to a fortified position. "All right," she said. They moved her things that evening, under the cloak of twilight. A few essential pots, her sacks of flour and beans, her precious notebook, and a small bundle of personal belongings. The room was small and stark, smelling of old wood smoke and iron, but it was clean, and the heavy oak door had a solid lock. It was a haven. The next day, she cooked in her new, cramped kitchen, the sounds of the sheriff's office a low murmur through the wall. It felt strange, a life reduced to a single, protected room. But the patrolmen came for their meals, and Mr. Claymore sent the miners over in small, quiet groups. She was still working. She was still fighting. Late that afternoon, the wind finally softened. The relentless, biting edge was gone, replaced by a gentle breeze that carried the scent of sage and distant rain. The light outside the single, barred window of her small kitchen turned golden. She heard the main office door open and close, heard Elias's heavy, familiar footsteps. A moment later, he was at her door. He was holding a clumsy, beautiful bouquet of flowers. They were wild prairie roses, their petals a delicate, blushing pink, their stems a tangle of sharp, protective thorns. They were not the cultivated, perfect roses of a general store catalog. They were hardy, defiant, and real, and they smelled of the sun and the raw, open land. He stepped into the small room, his broad shoulders seeming to fill the space. He did not offer them to her with a flourish. Instead, he simply set them on the small wooden table she used for chopping vegetables. The bright splash of color against the drab wood was startlingly beautiful. He looked at her, his gray eyes clear and serious, stripped of all pretense. He spoke, his voice low and certain, saying the words as if they were a statement of fact, a piece of testimony he was swearing to be true. "Her husband left her for gold," he said, his gaze holding hers. "The sheriff gave her roses and a forever home." The words hung in the quiet air between them. It was not a question. It was a declaration. It was the most astonishing, direct, and heartfelt thing anyone had ever said to her. Her breath caught in her throat, and she could not speak. He did not seem to expect an answer. He pulled out a chair from the table and sat down, his movements slow and deliberate, as if to give her time. He was not a man of pretty speeches or empty promises. He was a man of plans. "This does not have to be a cage, Ada," he said, his voice losing its formal tone and becoming something warmer, more personal. "It can be a beginning. I have been thinking. Your contract for the cooking is solid. The town council approved it. Creed cannot touch it. We can use that money to set up a payment plan for the mortgage, a legal, binding plan that he will have to accept. I will help you fix the roof on your cabin. We will do it together. With good timber, we will make it strong." He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table, his earnestness a palpable force in the small room. "And the water," he continued, his eyes glowing with a quiet fire. The well is the key. Creed is using it to bleed this town dry. But the town charter says that any essential resource can be managed for the public good in a time of crisis. This drought is a crisis. I am going to propose the formation of a Red Butte Community Water Fund, managed by a board of citizens. We will buy the water from Creed at a fair, legal rate, and we will distribute it to everyone for a single, small fee that goes into the fund. We will break his monopoly. We will give the town back its water. He was not just offering her a home. He was offering her a partnership. He was offering her a vision of a future that was not just about her own survival, but about justice and community. He saw her not as a victim to be rescued, but as an ally to stand with. Tears pricked at her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of a profound, overwhelming relief. She had been fighting alone for so long. She looked at the beautiful, thorny roses. "They need water," she whispered. She found an old tin can that had once held tomatoes, washed it out, and brought it to the table. He stood and helped her, his large, capable hands surprisingly gentle as he trimmed the thorny stems with his pocket knife. As she arranged the roses in the can, her fingers brushed against his. The touch was light, accidental, but it sent a shock of warmth all the way up her arm. She looked up and met his gaze. In his eyes, she saw no pity, only a deep, abiding respect and a quiet, steady affection that was more powerful than any passionate declaration. That night, she could not sleep. The weight of the day, of his words, of the future he had laid out before her, was too immense. She got up from her cot and walked into the main office. It was dark, except for the moonlight streaming through the front window. She saw his silhouette, a tall, solitary figure standing by the window, looking out at the sleeping town. She went and stood beside him, her shoulder almost touching his. They stood in silence for a long time, two guardians watching over the quiet streets. Below them, the town was a patchwork of deep shadows and silver light. It was a difficult place, full of harsh judgment and easy cruelty. But it was also a place of surprising strength and quiet decency. It was a place that might, just might, be worth fighting for. Without thinking, she leaned her head against his shoulder. He did not flinch or pull away. He simply stood there, solid and unmovable as the mountains on the horizon. His presence was a comfort, a quiet promise of strength and safety. It was not the fiery passion of a whirlwind romance. It was something deeper, quieter, and infinitely more real. It was the feeling of coming home. The rain began without warning, a strange, unseasonal gift that the parched land did not know how to receive. For weeks, the sky had been a merciless bowl of brass, but now it was a bruised, weeping gray. At first, the townsfolk of Red Butte welcomed it, the drops hissing on the hot dust, the scent of wet earth a long-forgotten perfume. But the rain did not stop. It fell with a grim, steady persistence, turning the streets to a thick, red mire. High in the mountains, the dry, cracked creek beds began to swell, channeling the downpour into a single, gathering force. The dry Needle River, long since a ghost of itself, was being reborn as a monster. He came with the rain. Ada was in the small kitchen of the sheriff's office, the scent of baking bread a warm defiance against the chill. When the door to the office flew open, a man stood there, silhouetted against the stormy gray light, dripping water onto the floorboards. He was thinner than she remembered, his face hollowed out by hunger and desperation, but she knew him instantly. It was Jebediah. He was not wearing the clothes of a prosperous miner. His coat was ragged, his boots worn through at the toes. He carried no gold, no sacks heavy with fortune. He carried only the same restless, feverish light in his eyes, now tainted with something darker, something cornered and dangerous. He was not alone. Behind him in the downpour, she could see the shifting, uneasy shapes of other men on horseback, their faces hidden by the brims of their wet hats. The dust jackals. "Ada," he said, his voice a rough rasp. He took a step inside, his eyes darting around the office, taking in the desk, the gun rack, her small kitchen beyond. "What are you doing here? This is the sheriff's place." Before she could answer, Elias Boone stepped out from the back room, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol. His face was calm, but his gray eyes were as hard and cold as river stones. "She is under my protection." "Jebediah," Elias said, his voice low and even, "your business here is with me." Jebediah let out a short, harsh laugh. "My business is with my wife." He pulled a crumpled, water-stained paper from his coat pocket and thrust it toward Ada. It was their marriage certificate. "This says you belong with me. This says that cabin is mine. We are leaving. Ada, I found a new strike. A real one this time. We will start over." Ada looked from the paper to his wild eyes, and she felt nothing but a vast, cold emptiness where her love for him used to be. The ghost of his promises no longer had any power over her. "No, Jeb," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the sound of the rain. "I am not going anywhere. I need a real roof over my head, not a promise you keep digging for in some other man's land." His face twisted with anger and disbelief. "You would choose this town, this lawman?" The confrontation was cut short by the frantic clang of the church bell, the same panicked alarm that had sounded during the train robbery. A man came running through the mud, his face ashen. "Sheriff, it is the river. It is coming up fast, and there are men at the bridge, the whole gang of them. They have got dynamite." Elias's gaze never left Jebediah, but his focus had shifted. "The bridge is their only way out. They mean to blow it behind them." He looked at Jebediah, and a cold understanding passed between them. "And your target was never the train, it was Creed's safe." Jebediah's desperate facade crumbled. "He cheated me. Ada, he tricked me into that loan. Pushed me out. Knowing I would fail, I was just coming back for what was mine." "There is nothing for you here," Elias said, his voice like iron. He began to move, issuing orders to the men who had gathered at the door. "Form a posse. We will meet them at the bridge. Do not let them set those charges." As the men scattered, a new, more sinister alliance revealed itself. Deputy Lane, who should have been organizing the riflemen, was in a heated, whispered conversation with Silas Creed near the bank. Creed's face was pale, his eyes wide with a fear that went beyond the loss of his money. He gestured frantically toward the bridge, and Lane nodded, a grim, determined look on his face. The deputy was not fighting for the town, he was working for the banker. The rain was coming down in blinding sheets now, and a low, continuous roar was building from the east. It was the sound of the flash flood, a wall of churning brown water and debris thundering down the narrow channel of the Dry Needle. Ada watched Ellis and the small group of townsmen run toward the river, their rifles held high against the rain. She felt a surge of helpless fear, but it was quickly replaced by a familiar, grounding instinct. These men would be cold, wet, and maybe wounded. They would need warmth. They would need strength. She did not hesitate. She grabbed a large iron pot, a sack of oats, and her leather pouch of medicinal herbs. She ran through the mud to the small church that stood on a slight rise, its steeple a lonely finger pointing at the angry sky. Using the covered porch as her shelter, she built a small, protected fire. As the floodwaters roared and the first flashes of lightning split the sky, Ada Whitfield organized a field kitchen. She set the oatmeal to boil, its simple, wholesome scent a small anchor of sanity in the chaos. She brewed a strong tea of willow bark for pain and chamomile for shock, her hands moving with the steady, practiced grace of a woman who knew her purpose. The bridge was a skeletal silhouette against the storm-lashed sky. The wooden pylons, which had stood for years in a dry riverbed, now groaned under the assault of the black, churning water. The river was a living beast, tearing at the banks, carrying whole trees in its current. On the far side, trapped by the rising water, Silas Creed stood by his wagon, his face a mask of terror. On the near side, the dust jackals worked frantically, trying to set their explosive charges on the bridge supports. Elias and his posse arrived. Taking cover behind a low ridge, the first shots rang out, sharp cracks that were almost lost in the roar of the water and the clap of thunder. Jebediah was with the outlaws, providing cover fire, his face a grim mask of desperation. Elias moved, using the lightning flashes for cover, getting closer to the bridge. He saw Jebediah reload and called out his name, his voice a bull roar over the storm. "Jebediah, it is over. Give it up." Jebediah turned, his rifle coming up, and for a heart-stopping moment, the two men faced each other across the maelstrom, the man who had abandoned Ada, and the man who had given her a reason to stay. Then, from the far bank, a new, terrible element entered the fray. Silas Creed, realizing his stolen safe was still with the robbers on the near side of the river, and that his incriminating loan documents were inside it, made a desperate move. He had a small bundle of dynamite in his own wagon, and in a fit of mad self-preservation, he lit the fuse, intending to throw it onto the bridge himself, to destroy the evidence of his crimes in one final cataclysmic blast. Ada, ladling hot porridge into a bowl for a shivering old man near the church, saw the sputtering fuse from a distance. She saw Elias and his men pinned down. She saw Jebediah caught in the middle. She saw the bridge, the town's only link, about to be blown to splinters. She dropped the ladle and she ran. She ran through the sucking mud, the cold rain plastering her hair to her face, her lungs burning. She did not know what she could do, only that she had to try. She scrambled down the slippery bank toward the bridge, screaming Elias's name. She reached the bridge approach just as Creed, with a wild cry, hurled the dynamite. It landed on the wooden planks, its fuse hissing like a snake. Elias was too far away. The outlaws were scattering. Ada did not stop. She scrambled onto the bridge, the slick planks trembling under her feet as the floodwaters hammered at the supports below. She reached the sputtering bundle, her fingers fumbling for the fuse. She grabbed it and pulled, extinguishing the spark just a second before it reached the blasting cap. A shot rang out, not from the outlaws, but from the town side. Deputy Lane, his betrayal now complete, had raised his pistol, aiming for the woman who was ruining his and Creed's plan. Time seemed to slow. Ada saw the flash from Lane's gun. She saw Jebediah's head snap around. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met. In his, she saw a flicker of the man he used to be, a ghost of the husband who had once sworn to protect her. He moved, a single, decisive lunge. He threw his body in front of hers, a human shield against the bullet meant for her. The impact threw them both sideways. Ada fell, the rough planks scraping her hands. Jebediah collapsed beside her with a soft, final sigh. A dark stain began to spread across the front of his ragged coat, a deeper red than the mud, a color as final as the storm itself. The rain washed over them, a cold, impartial baptism for the redeemed and the saved alike. The world returned in pieces, fractured and muted. The roar of the flood and the crack of the gunshot faded, replaced by the hushed, sucking sound of receding water and the soft, persistent drumming of the rain. Ada was on her knees on the slick, trembling planks of the bridge, the cold seeping through her dress, the smell of wet wood, river mud, and something else, something metallic and sharp, filled the air. Jebediah lay beside her, his head cradled in her lap. His eyes were open, but they were not looking at the storm anymore. They were looking at her. Elias was there in an instant, his face a grim mask of shock and fury. He kicked the pistol from Deputy Lane's hand, the metal skittering across the wet boards. With a swift, brutal efficiency, he slammed the deputy against a railing, disarming him of his other weapons and binding his hands with a length of rope from his belt. The fight had gone out of Lane, replaced by a slack-jawed terror. "It is over," Elias said, his voice a low growl that was more menacing than any shout. He turned his attention to the other outlaws, who were cornered and stunned. They threw down their weapons without a fight, their desperate gamble having collapsed into utter ruin. On the far bank, Silas Creed stood frozen, his face a pasty white in the gloom, a caricature of impotent rage and fear. But Ada saw none of it. Her world had shrunk to the space she occupied on the bridge with the dying man she had once loved. She pressed her hand to the wound in his chest, a futile gesture against the life that was steadily flowing out of him. "Jeb," she whispered, her voice breaking. His lips moved, and a faint, rattling sound came from his throat. "He set me up," he breathed, each word an immense effort. "Creed. From the start. That loan for the pump. He knew the vein was dry. He wanted the land. He wanted the well." His eyes searched her face, desperate for something, for understanding, for absolution. "I was so scared, Ada, not just of being poor. I was scared of you seeing that I was nothing, just a man full of empty words. Chasing gold was easier than facing your quiet strength." Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the rain. She saw it all then. Not a monster, not a villain, but a weak man, a frightened man, who had run from his own failings and in his fear, had almost destroyed them both. In his final act, he had found a sliver of the courage he had lacked in his life. She took his hand, her fingers lacing through his skin was cold and clammy. "I see you, Jebediah," she said softly. "It is all right. I forgive you." A shudder passed through his body, a release of a long-held tension, a faint smile, a ghost of his old quicksilver grins, touched his lips. He squeezed her hand, a flicker of his old strength, and then it was gone. His eyes lost their focus, gazing at something beyond the rain, and he was still. Elias knelt beside her, his presence a solid, comforting weight. He gently touched her shoulder. "Ada, we have to move him." They carried him back through the mud. A somber procession led by the sheriff. The townspeople who had huddled in their homes and in the church now emerged, their faces pale and etched with awe and sorrow. They saw the captured outlaws. They saw the disgraced deputy. And they saw Ada, her face a mask of grief, walking beside the men carrying her husband's body. There were no whispers now, no accusing glances. There was only a profound, humbled silence. They laid Jebediah on a pew in the church, the same church where Ada had been making porridge just a short time before. The world had turned upside down in the space of an hour. Elias posted guards on Lane and the rest of the dust jackals, securing them in the jail cells. He found the strongbox from the wagon, its lock still intact, and inside it, he found more than just the stolen payroll. He found Silas Creed's second ledger, the one that detailed a cruel and predatory web of usurious loans and fraudulent deeds, the proof of a systematic plundering of the town's hopes. As the long night wore on, the floodwaters began to recede, leaving behind a scarred landscape of mud and debris. The bridge still stood, but it was a battered skeleton, its foundations weakened, its planks torn and gouged. Red Butte was cut off, an island in a sea of mud, forced to confront its own wounds. Ada sat by Jebediah's side all night, a silent, solitary vigil. Elias brought her a blanket and a mug of the willow bark tea she had brewed. He did not speak, but he sat in the pew across from her for a long time, his presence a quiet promise that she was not alone. Jebediah passed just as the first pale, gray light of dawn broke through the clouds. It was a peaceful end. The fear and desperation had been washed from his face, leaving behind a younger, more vulnerable man than she remembered. Ada closed his eyes, a final act of tenderness. Later that morning, she found one of the wild roses Elias had given her, still miraculously intact in its tin can at the sheriff's office. She took a single, perfect bloom and placed it in Jebediah's still hands, a closing of a chapter, a farewell to a love that had been both a dream and a cage. 3 days later, the mud had dried enough for a circuit judge to arrive from Fort Shaw, his buggy escorted by 2 stern-looking soldiers. Justice in Red Butte was swift and unadorned. The trial was held in the saloon. the only building large enough to accommodate the entire town. One by one, miners and merchants and ranchers stood up and testified. They spoke of loans they could never repay, of deeds signed under duress, of interest rates that choked the life from their businesses. Henry, the miner Ada had rescued from the wagon crash, his leg now healing, spoke of how Creed had tried to seize his claim over a manufactured debt. The second ledger, presented by Sheriff Boone, was the final, irrefutable proof. It was a meticulous record of Creed's greed. Silas Creed, stripped of his fine clothes and his smug superiority, seemed to shrink before their eyes, becoming a small, withered man consumed by his own avarice. Deputy Lane, his face sullen and defiant, refused to speak, but his guilt was plain for all to see. The judge's verdict was delivered without ceremony. Lane was sentenced to 20 years of hard labor for his part in the robbery and for the shooting of Jebediah Whitfield. The remaining members of the Dust Jackals received similar sentences. For Silas Creed, the punishment was more profound. He was found guilty of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted destruction of public property. The judge, invoking a territorial law regarding assets acquired through criminal enterprise, declared the Red Butte Bank and all its holdings forfeit. In a move that stunned the silent courtroom, the judge then decreed that the assets of the bank would be used to establish the Red Butte Community Water Fund, just as Elias had proposed. The fund would be managed by a board of 5 elected townspeople, its charter to ensure that the water from Alligator Well and the river would be a resource for all, not a commodity for one. Sheriff Elias Boone was appointed its temporary overseer, a steward to guide the town in its first steps toward a shared and just future. Justice had been served. It had been a costly, painful, and bloody affair, but it was a real and lasting victory. The power that had choked the town for so long had been broken. As the soldiers led Creed and Lane away in chains, a quiet, hopeful murmur went through the crowd. It was the sound of a town beginning to breathe again. The next day, they buried Jebediah in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. It was a simple service, attended only by Ada, Elias, and the preacher. The new day was bright and clear, the sky washed clean by the storm. As the last spadeful of earth was laid upon the grave, Ada stepped forward. She took from her pocket another of the wild prairie roses. She laid the single, thorny stem upon the fresh earth. It was not a gesture of romantic love, but one of peace and finality. She was closing a door, not with anger or regret, but with a quiet, solemn acceptance. The past was now where it belonged, buried. She turned away from the grave and looked out at the town below, at the smoke rising from the chimneys, at the skeleton of the bridge waiting to be rebuilt. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt the unmistakable, fragile, and tenacious feeling of hope. The storm had washed Red Butte clean, not just of its dust, but of its malice. In the weeks that followed, a new spirit took root in the town, a quiet, industrious sense of shared purpose. The first project, undertaken without a formal vote or committee, was the rebuilding of Ada Whitfield's cabin. It was as if the entire town, shamed by its former cruelty and inspired by her resilience, needed a physical act of atonement. The men who had once looked at her with suspicion now came with hammers and saws. Henry, the miner whose life she had saved, was the first to arrive, his legs still in a brace, but his hands eager to work. He was followed by ranchers, storekeepers, and even Mr. Claymore, who directed the placement of the foundation stones with the same gruff authority he used in his inn. They tore down the old, chinked walls that had failed to keep out the wind and raised a new frame of sturdy, sweet-smelling pine. They put on a new tin roof that gleamed in the autumn sun, a defiant silver shield against any future storms. The women came too. They brought pots of hot coffee and baskets of bread. Their conversation no longer filled with sharp whispers, but with a quiet, newfound respect. They did not pry or offer pity. They simply worked alongside Ada, planting a new garden, their hands in the same rich earth, together. They built a new fence, not of rough timber, but of carefully placed stones and woven willow branches, leaving space along the front for the wild prairie roses Ada had begun to cultivate from cuttings. The house was no longer just her cabin. It was a testament to a community that had found its heart again. Ada, in turn, found a new way to serve that community. With a small sum of money Jebediah had left in his pockets and a modest loan from the newly formed town fund, she did not just reopen her kitchen, she transformed it. She bought the small, abandoned building next to the blacksmith shop and, with Elias's help, converted it into a proper eatery, a hand-painted sign, crafted by the town's carpenter, swung from a post out front. It read, in neat, clear letters, "The Iron Pot and Wild Rose." It was more than just a place to eat. It became the town's hearth. Miners and ranchers sat at the same long, scrubbed pine tables, their old divisions softened by the shared experience of good, honest food. During the dry season, when work was scarce, a pot of free oatmeal porridge simmered on the stove all day, no questions asked. In the wet, cold months, she served thick, hearty stews that warmed a man from the inside out. Her little leather-bound notebook was now filled with recipes, each one a memory, each one a celebration of the stubborn, tenacious bounty of the land. Her relationship with Elias Boone settled into a rhythm as comfortable and steady as the changing seasons. He did not court her with grand gestures or passionate declarations. His love was a quiet, constant presence, a series of small, meaningful acts. He never failed to stop by at the end of the day, not as the sheriff, but as a man seeking the quiet comfort of home. He would take off his gun belt, hang it on a peg by the door, and wordlessly begin to wash the mountain of dishes left over from the evening meal, his large hands surprisingly careful with her plates and mugs. Sometimes, as she worked beside him, kneading dough for the next day's bread, he would reach out and tuck a stray sprig of fragrant sweetgrass, which he had picked on his patrols, behind her ear. They spoke little during these times, but the silence was filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. He was not rushing her, not trying to replace the husband she had just buried. He was simply there, a steady, patient presence, waiting for her to be ready. One spring evening, as the last of the snow melted and the first green shoots began to push through the red earth, they took in a new resident. It was Tala, the little Cheyenne girl Ada had rescued from the wagon wreck. Her father, Henry, had passed from his injuries a few months after the flood, and the child had been left in the care of the kindly but overwhelmed preacher and his wife. Ada and Elias had visited her often, and a quiet, powerful bond had formed between the woman who had lost a husband and the child who had lost a father. That evening, Elias brought Tala to the cabin, her small bundle of belongings in his hand. Ada knelt down and looked into the little girl's dark, solemn eyes. "Would you like to stay here?" Tala, Ada asked softly. "With us, we could plant roses together." A slow, brilliant smile spread across the child's face, and she threw her small arms around Ada's neck. In that moment, the cabin, built by the hands of the community, finally became a home, a family. The next day, Elias and Ada, with Tala running between them, planted a trellis against the front of the house. They carefully transplanted the thorny, resilient wild rose cuttings, their hands working together in the rich soil, planting the roots of their new life. When they were finished, Elias took Ada's hand, his fingers warm and strong around hers. "Will you marry me, Ada?" he asked, his voice as quiet and serious as the mountains on the horizon. She looked at their new home, at the child laughing as she chased a butterfly, at the strong, steady man standing beside her. She had not waited to be chosen. She had chosen herself, her work, her place in the world. And now, this good and decent man was choosing her in return. "Yes, Elias," she said, her voice full of a quiet, certain joy. "Yes, I will." Weeks later, on a sun-drenched afternoon when a warm wind blew across the prairie, making the grasses whisper. Ada sat on her new porch. Tala was napping inside, and Elias was at his office, overseeing the final repairs to the town bridge. Ada had a piece of paper and a pen, and she was writing a letter. It was a reply to a young woman from a neighboring settlement, a girl she had never met, who had written to her after hearing her story, asking a simple, heartbreaking question. How does one find a way to be loved? Ada dipped her pen in the ink, the words coming to her not from a place of sorrow, but from a place of hard-won peace. Do not wait to be chosen, she wrote. Choose yourself first. Choose your own strength, your own work, your own worth. Build a life that is sturdy and true. Then, if you are lucky, the right person will come along and choose to build it with you. She looked up from the letter, out at the vast, open land. The wind rustled the new leaves on the rose trellis, a sound like a gentle promise. The town of Red Butte was quiet. The scars of the flood and the fury were fading, replaced by the steady, hopeful rhythm of life. Justice had been done. Prejudice was giving way to respect. And the heart of the community, like the roses on her porch, was beginning to bloom. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And remember to subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story and video can be heard by more people.